Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining today's webinar from Prismic, where we have Danny and John from Arkade that have already joined us. And we'll get started in, I guess, a few minutes. We'll wait for a little bit more people to come in. All right, guys, so I guess we're going to get started here. People will be joining in. Feel free to ask any questions throughout the webinar. We'll be addressing them at the end of the session here. We're banking on basically about 40 to 50 minutes of us just talking here. Well, mainly John and Danny doing the talking here about their own case study, about their own great work here that they've done with Prismic. But if you want to follow along, we have some slides here that you can just click on there. So here we go. So first of all, good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending on where you are. Thanks for joining us today in the Prismic webinar with Danny Phillips and John Gabriel from Arkade. Today we'll be talking about aligning content, commerce, and customer. So first, a brief introduction on Prismic. What's Prismic? We're a component-based CMS, which makes creating, managing, engaging e-commerce content easy, basically. So we're going to be talking about us in the prism of an e-commerce platform. So today it's used by e-commerce, big and small, and basically allows developers and content editors to design, create websites really easily, and they run exactly like you want them to, and they look exactly like they want to. And enables marketers, content teams to really just to create pages, CTAs, landing pages, without the need of any kind of technical team. In terms of key features that we have for e-commerce, slices, which are basically the components of the components-based CMS, and they allow you to have flexible templates that you can kind of dynamically create on the fly. Another one is integration fields, which allows you to connect to your product catalog and connect your content there inside of Prismic to showcase any kind of specific product that you're looking for. And the last one we're going to talk is about scheduling and releases, the ability to have the content editors bulk upload content and publish it whenever they want. So super useful for any kind of thing like a campaign or some kind of like Black Friday or some kind of thing like that, an event. So on the right, we're seeing some logos here of some of the e-commerce currently using Prismic for those purposes. But on to our speakers. So today we have Danny and John. They're both co-founders of Arkade, a Melbourne-based agency who see every point of friction in the customer journey as an opportunity to think differently about elevating the customer experience. Danny, he's inspired by the customer-centric revolution that's shifting the retail landscape. And Danny has spent his career discussing the bond between brand and consumer and how it should be earned and owned rather than rented or bought. John's passion lies in solving hard technical problems so brands can evolve as quickly as their customers do. So I'll hand it over to you guys.
Cool.
Thanks, Arkade. Sure thing.
So I figured I'd just give you a bit of background of sort of why we're in this game, what we stand for, and how we achieve what we do, and that sort of gives us a good lead into the content side of things and how we use Prismic. Customer experience is one of those terms where I think it's a pretty loaded term, and it's been commandeered by a few different parts of the industry, specifically in discretionary retail. So we're seeing CX being something that's owned by marketing or it's owned by customer service. We really do think it's a multidisciplinary exercise where it's about bringing the needs of the customer across all parts of the business. It's really about helping them buy more than necessarily helping the brand sell. To that end, we've coined this term of intentional economy, this idea that especially now with COVID, changing the way customers behave. We think this is something that was coming along before this, but I think this has really just accelerated it. This idea that people will treat their time and their attention a little bit more carefully. So they're going to be more interested in dealing with brands and experiences that are a bit more meaningful to them, that when they do buy things or browse around, they're going with a specific job or purpose in mind, and they're trying to get a solution to a particular problem. It's sort of like taking the whole jobs to be done framework to its sort of logical conclusion. We think there's going to be a lot less of just this people browsing around aimlessly through malls for hours at a time and browsing through hundreds of sites or marketplaces and really sort of going to where they want to go, and aligning to brands that they care about. So to do that well, you really got to think a little bit more deeply about a few different parts of your business. We're seeing the sort of 3 C's of this. I think if marketing's got their 4 Ps, we're sort of trying to adopt a 3 C's mentality, and make sure that these things get equal weight. Often the silos that exist in businesses mean that the e-commerce or commerce teams work over here and the marketing and content teams work over here, and the people that are in charge of retail experience or in-store sales are probably in another building, if not another part of the country in some cases. So we really think that these 3 things, being the customer, content and commerce, need to have equal weight and be very intertwined with each other in the way that they're implemented and adopted across the business. So from a customer point of view, that means knowing, in sort of focusing on what we call zero-party data, as opposed to just first-party and second-party and third-party data, really understanding what it is a customer chooses to share with you. The known customer, not the capital C customer, as in all customers who might look or feel like this, but people by name. So we think it's in every brand's interest to make sure that they know all of their best customers by name, and that every transaction and interaction the customer shares with the brand, because it's meaningful to them, and it means it creates information and utility that helps them buy over time. And more importantly, they can pick up where they left off. On the commerce side, it's really about making sure that we blur the lines between in-store and online, especially for omni-channel retailers. We're seeing a lot of, traditionally when it came to commerce, the e-commerce website was store number 52, whereas now we want to see it more like square meter number 52 of every store. But now that the tables have turned and a lot of businesses have really focused on e-commerce alone, and the stores have been closed or are now reopening, the idea that the stores are now an extension of the digital strategy of the digital store. So we're sort of seeing a bit of a pretty serious role reversal there, that the role that each property plays in the discovery, transaction, and take delivery process. When you think about what commerce really is, in store, it's a POS, which is a special machine that takes money off customers that has to be operated by a staff member, whereas the website is this other POS that can only be used by customers, and they must not be in the store when they use it. We're seeing those lines blur. I mean, I think most customers have got a POS in their pocket that's probably better than the computer behind the counter, but we don't see many brands thinking of their e-commerce site as a BYO POS terminal that those customers could be using to achieve some pretty interesting commerce experiences in store. Click and collect, endless aisle, store to door, all of these other mechanics have got their catchy names, but all they are is just commerce, where the process of discovering a product, paying for that product, and taking delivery of it are being merged and smooshed across all these different channels. So customer and commerce are really important. And the final piece, which is really what we're going to focus on today, is content. We definitely don't want to confuse content with the idea of marketing campaigns. In this instance, we're focusing on the content of the brand, the stories that it needs to tell in order to differentiate itself from the next clothing retailer or homewares retailer or dining experience or anything. I mean, anything that you might be thinking of, it's about the stories that you tell. And what we're seeing is a pretty sort of serious revolution here in what's being called headless commerce, headless CMS, where we're starting to blur the lines between customer content and commerce into digital experiences that are operated and used by the customer, that can transition between who am I and what do I mean to the brands? What stories am I trying to understand about the brands? And I'm trying to transact right now, and backwards and forwards through that within a second, a minute, or days or weeks. So it's quite an interesting time, I think, and I think we're starting to see brands really come together and break down the barriers and silos that would normally keep these 3 disciplines well and truly at arm's length from each other. So I'm going to throw to John, who's going to talk through a particular case study that we've been working on over the last few months.
Cheers, thanks, Dan. Do you mind going over to the next slide? Awesome.
Absolutely.
So look, to give everyone a bit of background into this case study, the organisation that we worked with here is called 3x1. 3x1's a house of denim brands. It was founded here in Melbourne. The brands we specifically designed the solution we're going to talk through today were New Denim, Rollers Jeans, and A-Brand Jeans. So the team there approached us really to focus on building out a strong foundation to support their growth locally and internationally from a direct-to-consumer point of view. And the immediate wins to support that were very much focused on content and commerce capability. Coming into the project, the team there had decided prior that they wanted to implement Shopify Plus as their preferred commerce platform. And along with that, they also wanted to design a single user experience that the three brands could enjoy, and also localized content for Australia, New Zealand, US, and the EU. So jumping ahead into a little bit of an overview of the platform architecture next. Great. So the first question was really how do we approach the project structurally, and we ended up taking a headless path with that. And there are some good reasons for that. Generally speaking, there's a lot of advantages to taking a headless approach. However, in the case of 3x1, there were really two key reasons that we went down that path. The first was mainly a technical one. So as you'll see in that platform architecture there, and I'll talk to that a bit more in detail in a second, you'll notice the 3 Shopify instances for each brand. And that was really because Shopify doesn't support localized pricing or base prices being the local currency unless you do have an instance for each of those regions. So we had that challenge to begin with, and then we also wanted to make sure that we were building a single front end to connect that that experience. Connected with that issue, then we had a URL structure problem, which is a very fine detail, but if anyone who's explored using Shopify in this way, you'd know that you pretty much have to use subdomains to support that. And from an SEO point of view, and some other reasons, we didn't want to go down that path. So the second reason, I think, was more generally relevant than that. It was really about making sure that we weren't tied to a single platform. We wanted the ability to design for the customer first and foremost, and then work out which platforms needed to be there, whether they were existing ones or new ones we needed to introduce to support that experience. And I suppose in line with that, again, we also wanted to make sure that all this investment that we were putting into building that front-end experience was something that would outlive any of the platform choices that we were making today. So drilling into that platform architecture diagram a little bit, as I mentioned, we've got the 3 Shopify instances in place that handle local pricing, product availability, and transactions. And as you'll see to the right there, they're integrated back into an ERP platform called Sin7. Algolia, the next platform down there, handles search, product list pages, sorting, and filtering. If you're not familiar with Algolia, I definitely recommend going and having a look at that platform. And lastly, and of course, Prismic, which handles navigation and content across content for campaigns, but also content for products and other miscellaneous content as well.
Yeah, we also recommend Algolia, usually with a lot of our customers. A lot of e-commerce platforms use Algolia. It's pretty seamless normally to connect the two of them. And John, I'm actually kind of curious, so you're saying why headless and all that, and this is great because there's a lot of agencies that haven't made that jump there, and they're still on more traditional, CMSs. And I'm kind of wondering, like, was this your first fully headless e-commerce structure or stack here, or was this like, how were you familiar with that, and what were some of the challenges, I guess, switching?
Yeah, sure. Look, it wasn't our first in the sense that we've been building solutions that require that headless architecture for a long time now, whether it's custom mobile applications or e-com sites and other things. We've often had to take that approach in the past. It's funny there. It's almost, what's old is new again, in a sense. Back in the day, we had to use headless in a lot of cases, and now, everything went to be more platform specific, and now we're back to where we were. Look, there certainly were some challenges worth noting. I think for anyone listening today who's maybe considering going down this path, I strongly recommend that you speak to people who've had experience implementing headless, particularly with the platforms that you're considering using. Not because it's terribly difficult. We often hear that headless is a very expensive exercise. I think that if you take a longer term view of that, I don't think that's necessarily true. But nonetheless, there are a lot of features and functionality that tend to get handled by default by a platform like a Shopify, and they do a great job of that. But when you move to a headless world, you sort of have to reconsider a lot of those features and functions again. And making sure you adapt them into your plan is pretty important. So I suppose moving on, then we asked the question, why Prismic? So again, there's a few reasons for that. And as I mentioned, we use Prismic in a range of different applications, everything from fairly static, simple websites through to complex commerce builds like this one here and native mobile apps, like I mentioned before. In terms of 3x1 though, there were several immediate and future requirements that we had to address in no particular order. The first was supporting multiple complex content items or slices like you talked about before. And that was not just that. There are other platforms that you could solve that with, but we also wanted to have a simple content architecture that we could then use to share those components and content across a website. So thinking about different sections of a website, like the product detail page and category pages and things like that. And that, when I say sharing in that sense, I'm talking about the content as well as the content items themselves. And then, as I mentioned at the beginning, we're looking to build a single front end that all the brands could enjoy. So the user experience across the three brands really does match. It's the content and the styling and the brand essence that really makes the difference. So we wanted to make sure that anything that we invested in terms of content items could be capitalized across the three, and so they needed to be transferable across the three as well. Then looking forward a little bit, we then considered issues of localization and personalization. At the moment, the brands are doing a degree of localized content. I mean, certainly in terms of the product content that I talked about at the start, but also, in terms of navigation and things like that, there's opportunities there as well.
Yeah, that's something we definitely hear a lot about, especially people that are like rapidly growing e-commerce platforms that just have like maybe 1 or 2 markets. Right now, you're just mentioning 3 markets, but the ability to just add like a Shopify instance with like a different currency and just add another locale within Prismic. I've actually heard like some e-commerce platforms be able to like create, I think it was like North Korea market, if I'm not mistaken, and just basically copy all the content they had, or sorry, South Korea, and just copy all the content really, really quickly inside of Prismic. So that is a big thing. I know that a lot of people face that challenge of, hey, maybe we should consider using a CMS because maybe they're using kind of like niche CMS for their own use case. But whenever we start talking about localization and how that works, it's usually a pretty complex feature. And so having that built in usually makes it a lot easier to grow and expand to other markets.
Definitely. And I think Danny will expand on this a little bit further in terms of how we go about designing content items. But that's a really interesting point in the way that there's multiple ways to handle that with Prismic, whether it's completely different language versions of the same content or whether it's just subtle differences in displaying or hiding certain elements of the content depending on the region. So there's some exciting possibilities there for sure.
We're also playing a bit of a long game too here because we think that it's not only these websites, but we're well and truly planning to have other digital experiences that the customers will be interacting with that won't be squarely inside the .com website. There might be other things, whether they be apps, even digital signage. There's all other things that are coming down the track pretty fast that this is setting some fairly solid foundations for, because we've managed to abstract the idea of content away from delivery, which we'll go through in a bit more detail later on.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, definitely. The next thing we needed to support, which was a little bit unique, was a 4-level navigation structure. We looked at solving that with Shopify, and we found that we couldn't access that level of detail by the Shopify API. And then looking to Prismic as a solution, it is a very elegant solution for handling that component of the site. And a 4-level navigation structure doesn't sound like a lot, but it is a little bit unique. Then moving down, we obviously needed to choose a platform that was going to be easy for the team at 3x1 to work with, and make sure that we didn't choose something that required a lot of training. So the wider team at 3x1 could get involved in authoring content.
What was the feedback on that? Like, how's the team been like adopting the tool, shall we say?
Yeah.
Has it required you guys to do like specific training sessions and all that? Because that's a big question I get asked from people. Like, how much time am I going to need to like, be able to just like be able to publish content, to copy content, things like that?
Yeah, look, the normal workflow that we follow there is that we design a content component together with designers and developers. And then once it actually gets produced so that it's available to be executed in campaigns on the front end, there's a training piece that goes with that just to explain all the different possible configurations and make sure there's examples of content that have been tested through that process. And really with that and some fairly minor documentation, it's enough for people to be able to run with.
I think one early little gotcha to watch out for is if you're considering Prismic, the last thing you want to do is let the people that will be authoring the content go and have a look at it and play with it to start with. I think that can be a bit of a trap, because I think the people that author the content and produce it day in, day out will understand the concept much better once they've got their content types designed sort of for them, that the template structure. If you let them in too early, because there's that sort of that meta level of the content than the content itself. I think even our own early experiences a few years ago when we first started playing with a few different CMSs, that trying to design a template, a content item type, and put content in it at the same time, it can do your head in a little bit. So I think making sure that you separate you don't let your broader team access to an empty version of Prismic. You need to make sure you've got some examples of some content types built for them first and show them how that works for them and how easy it is to change them over time, not let them in cold with the first thing you have to do is build a type or a template, then you can start putting your content in. I think that's a trap for young players if you let people loose on it too early. For sure.
Like, it's true. Like, obviously, we recommend, like, if you're trying out Prismic for the first time, probably be a developer so you can like have a better sense of what's going on. Otherwise, whenever we talk to like maybe project managers or more like high level content editors, we do at least put some custom types in the actual repository inside of Prismic, so they know how to do that. But it's true. Once they understand that gap, and I think we'll talk a little bit more about that once we see those the designs in between like custom types and Prismic and what it corresponds to on the front end. Once it clicks into gear, I think people start getting it, and you can then empower them basically to start creating their own custom types. Like they can like then kind of like decode whatever designs they have and start building them the custom types so that the developers just makes their work easier. But it's true, you do need that little like ramp up period, I would say, to understand exactly. Yeah. What is this slice? Again, going from a WordPress where it's like, this is just the page, this is it, it's pretty straightforward, to like, no, this is a component, and then it's being exposed by an API and all that. It's a little hard to click in the gear. Yeah, there's a conceptual learning curve that I think can be intimidating, but once you're past it, it actually, the payoff's definitely worth it. So it's just, for people that have got traditional CMS experience, that initial conceptual jump is worth pushing through because the other side is, greener fields, that's for sure.
Well, the best example of that, Danny, is the extreme version, right? It's going from here's a WYSIWYG editor to here's structured content. Yeah. And the feeling of loss of control through that process, but then realizing it's actually a liberating force, if anything. Definitely. Okay, so moving on, I'll just take you through a quick example about how these different platforms are pulled together and manifest themselves in a front end. I've chosen here a product detail page because it does draw on lots of different elements from those underlying platforms. Just before I get into the detail of sort of which platform is doing what there, it's probably worth touching on the Next.js framework and how that plays a role. So as you can see on the right there in that little diagram, Prismic, Shopify Plus, and Algolia being the primary platforms that are driving the front end, they make all of their content available via their API. But instead of presenting that live to the front end when a user lands on the website, instead we're pre-rendering that content on the server side, and we're storing it as a static version for most of the elements. And there are elements that you can't do that for sure, but for most of the elements, so that when the customer lands on the site, it's already been computed as to what should be displayed, and it's much faster. So most of the performance gains come from exactly that. Elements, as I mentioned before, like the bag and what's in your shopping bag, things like size, availabilities don't get handled in that way. So it's just about getting those two factors right and making sure the right elements are static and the right elements can punch through. So looking over to the design there, you can see in the top left-hand corner, search is handled by Algolia. I'm not going to spend too much time on that today. Navigation, that 4-level nav, which is closed up there, but that's all handled by Prismic.
So that means that the content editors can actually like switch things around. So like I see this a lot. Like imagine they're some kind of new collection, they want to like really highlight that in the menu. They potentially could add an item there.
Oh, absolutely, absolutely. And the menu can be configured to be regionally specific as well. And exciting opportunities in the future around how the menu items could actually be personalized. All of this is so much more possible now with platforms like Prismic. As Danny, I'm sure we'll get into later, the challenge becomes the content and creating the content more than the capability to execute it. Yeah, so moving down the page there, most of the core product information comes from Shopify itself. You might see it just snuck in the middle there. The size guide is something that we built as a Prismic component. Again, that's a great contender to be regionally specific. Thinking of centimeters versus inches is maybe a great example there of where you might need different versions of the content for different regions. And that's not even getting into language. So moving down a little bit, we then start to see some of the more complex content blocks come in that our goal is powering. Do you mind jumping to the next slide?
Yep.
Adrian? So here's a couple of examples here of some fairly complex blocks. And as you can see there, the montage, and then below that the video block, and then below that still you've got sort of the core service promise block. And on the right showing how, again, using Prismic, we've configured these content items so that they can set mobile specific versions of those items. Sometimes it's hard to deliver rich content like this if you have to do it in a responsive way. Sometimes it's easier just to deploy 2 versions of the content, and that's what we're supporting here. And moving down a little bit further,
I was just
you'll see.
Touch briefly on this. Like this is actually, I think you guys have not implemented this for this particular project, is integration fields. But like basically this is a great component example where we see a lot of people like showcasing specific products here and like basically just like enriching them. Kind of in the slides that we're seeing here, where you're putting like just like different pictures, editing the text and all that. A lot of times, if the people want to showcase like 1 or 2 specific items, we'll add them there, or like highlighted items. And that's usually a feature that we're seeing a lot more people like using, because sometimes some of the editing options basically are a little bit limited, shall we say, in Shopify Plus. So they want to have that ability.
Definitely, definitely. And if you go into the next slide there, you'll see a good example of sort of a parallel point there, which is just around how flexible Prismic is, that it lets you bring in content elements that are indirectly coming from Shopify. So if you look at those 2 panels on that middle screen, at the bottom they're bringing in recommended products. Those products are coming through from Shopify, but the choices as to which products those should be is being handled on the Prismic side. So we can link that through to a collection on the Shopify side, and that will suck through the relevant products that are currently part of that collection with all the merchandising capability of Shopify behind the scenes. So we use integration fields for Shopify with Prismic in some other examples. But it's also good to know how flexible it is, that you don't have to go down that path, and you can store, third-party attributes essentially in Prismic and execute them on the front end.
Yeah, people have been using that for a while. It's just the issue of human errors, and whenever they put like some kind of mistake there, and there's some issue on the front end, they're like, what's happening? So yeah, the original core thought there for the integration field was to have that no more human error. You just like select items, but it's through a collection like that, and having that specific reference, I guess, from Shopify Plus, that's the best solution right now.
Yeah, that's a good way of doing it. And then over to the right, you can see the footer menu also handled by Prismic again. So I hope that makes sense as to how sort of a relatively complex page with various different layers comes together and draws on those different platforms. Out of all of that, though, if you jump to the next slide and we think about custom types or slices in Prismic, for a relatively sophisticated website in terms of the different content items that they can execute and all the different places they can do that, we really only end up with 10 or so custom content types. And there's a lot you can do. It all comes down to how you architect the content types, of course. But if you provide the right level of customization ability within each, then you end up with fewer as a result of that, which is not daunting at all.
And for sure, this is like the best practice we recommend people doing whenever they're like, using a specific custom type for a specific page, like having that footer nav, having the fit guide. You can actually sometimes we see people putting like just like the mega nav into and the footer nav like in the same document. But otherwise, just having specific custom types for that, because I have seen some e-commerce platforms that have just like a page document and they just have like 100 slices, and definitely not recommended there. Just in terms of UX, being able to like navigate through all of that, it just makes it a nightmare. Whereas for the content editors, this is clear. Okay, I just want to have the fit guide. I want to like customize it. I want to like localize it, whatever. It just makes it much more straightforward.
Absolutely. Okay, so jumping on to the next section there. In terms of results, the 3 brand sites went live in market in May this year. And they're currently serving customers in 4 regions, depending on which site. They are sharing the same underlying tech and content architecture, which has meant that the experience since go live has been that the amount of support that we've had to provide around those pieces has been extremely efficient. And the optimizations that we've implemented have also been very easy to do because they are the same architecture. The other interesting thing we found is that the content architecture, and Danny will talk a bit about the right way to go about designing that in a minute, but the content architecture that we designed as part of the project hasn't had to change much at all to support all of the campaigns that have happened since then. And I think that's really the art of getting that right. If you can design it up front, test it, make sure that it just has some longevity and don't fall into that campaign cycle, there's a lot to be gained there.
And that's what I recommend to the designers or to the content editors. Give as many design elements as you can to the developers, so that like in that first MVP or whatever it is, you have as many slices and you have as many options available to you. Now, obviously we can iterate and we can talk about that. We're going to talk about that afterwards. But for sure, like, load it up with all the items there, because otherwise you can be limited, I guess, in terms of options for your campaigns.
Definitely. And again, Danny, I'm sure we'll talk more in detail about this, but that collaboration between the development and the design team is critical. To just explore all the different possibilities that might be around a relatively simple request to say, hey, can the button be white or can it be black, please? But okay, let's talk about colors. Why don't we just make it so it can be anything? And we've solved a lot of problems there.
Just put a color picker.
Danny might disagree with that in a minute. So what else? I mean, performance-wise, we're really happy with the results as well. It's not something that we specifically invested in to date. In this particular build, it's something that's on the roadmap, but the results that we're achieving there are much better than the previous platform and are definitely in line with other premium sites at the moment. And we've also seen, so from the business's point of view, the trade results have exceeded expectations as well. So I think all in all, we've put together a solid platform, and it's there available to optimize and introduce new and personalized, especially services and experience that will come over the next 2 to 3 years. And on that note, I might let Danny have a go.
Yeah, you set up some big expectations there. I was biting my tongue the whole way through. It's great. The whole making it flexible, we're talking about that sort of definition of the content model and the content taxonomy. I think depending on what industry you're in, the concept of designing a content model is fairly foreign to a lot of brands. It's not something that comes naturally, and it's not something you're doing all the time. One of the things that we really find for people that have gone through the process of doing designs for print or doing designs for EDMs or traditional WYSIWYG type content editors is that the idea of stepping away and thinking about your structure and your ingredients first and getting that bit straight, and then how do those ingredients come together to deliver stories, I think has always been the big challenge to overcome, and that's the thing that's the most important thing to get through. I think the realization that the brands have stories to tell, but stories are always made up of certain beats, and those beats are what you're trying to design together. So I think a lot of the time it's about working with developers and designers together and the brand content people to realize that they're not being, I think when they first see this process, they can see it as very restrictive. that if I just get given a blank piece of paper, I can do whatever I like. Whereas this feels like I'm filling in form fields, and that doesn't feel like the way I want to design.
I also get that a lot from content like, hey, I want to add this. Do I have to go to a developer? Like, why do I have to go through a developer if I want to add something new? This is frustrating. How can I do this on my own? Things like that.
Yeah, and I mean, we sort of put that down here in this idea of separating campaigns from capability there on step 3, and to this point from Seth, give me constraints. We think, I mean, you can't use this line in the heat of battle sometimes because I think it really just upsets designers. But the idea that the constraint is what's going to bring out your creativity, and when you're designing an ad for a magazine, the first thing you ask is, can I have a different size piece of paper? You design within the constraints of or I'm doing some digital signage on a TV. Can I please have it in portrait instead of landscape? Well, the TV's a landscape. That's just the process. Even though all these selfie videos, I think we're going to have TVs that are portrait soon enough. So this idea that the constraints, will set you free is kind of like the spirit of things you need to get through. But you need to sell that concept early, because if you try to sell it halfway through the process, you won't get the same sort of buy-in. But it's about, but once you realize using the way the slices work and the reusable elements there, once you realize that all content is a combination of imagery, which images are just gray rectangles, words that can only be in a heading or a subheading, and then some colors and some fonts and positioning type variables, then by going through that hard work of stepping back and understanding the structure of your content and building configuration into that means that when you want to change, when you want to replatform, when you want to repurpose, you're not cutting and pasting everything from scratch again. It's not like trying to cut and paste things out of Word documents and it all just becoming a jumbled mess. That this effort will pay off. And as people are trying to be more and more agile and change tack quickly and take advantage of a new opportunity, if you've painted yourself into a traditional CMS corner, you won't be able to move fast. It just won't happen. So it's about realizing that, yes, a race car is probably isn't as comfortable to sit in, but once you understand how all the buttons and switches work, you can move a lot faster. And I think everyone, from the simplest junior designer through to the CTO, we need to really take content more seriously, because it's the one differentiating asset you've got outside of customer and the way that you trade. So I still see a lot of time and effort being put into content. For the last 5 or 10 years, most of that ends up in some other platform called social media, which you don't even own. So I think now that we're coming back to brands realizing that the best place for their most premium stories is on their own properties, and for all your social media marketers that are just playing on Instagram and Facebook and everything else, that now start coming home and doing it properly on our own property is what we really need to focus on. So I think, investing in this workflow and this capability, and changing some of the cultural blockers that have stopped people taking proper structured content seriously, even though it's been available to us for literally 20 years, I think now's the time to grow up and take it seriously, because the channels on which you're going to want to communicate in the next 1 year, 5 years are going to explode. And if you don't, then you'll be putting your content out on social media and paying to access your own audience instead of bringing your audience home to your own properties. I think there's a great video. We've got a link here, which we'll add on the presentation, or we can share in the notes. But Prismic have got a great video and an intro to custom type building, which is about setting up all these custom types. There's so many different ways to skin the cat with respect to setting up your content structures. Yes, one big mega document with infinite number of slices, or content types for certain page types. There's no right or wrong way to do it. I think as soon as things start getting too deep or too wide, you might have taken a very specific strategy that might not necessarily be right. It might be right. I don't want to.
It depends on the use case. Completely agree with you, Danny. It completely depends on the use case. And some landing pages, some like completely free-form pages, it's fine to have a ton of slices if they're like it's really rich design elements. Again, what I've seen in the past though, it's like maybe add more options in the slices. Like maybe add a field that allows you to have like a positioning on an image, or as I mentioned, like something like a color picker. Although I know that's a hot topic. But yeah, there are some ways to maybe like reduce that, but it depends on the kind of content.
Yeah, I mean, I think one thing to keep in mind with this sort of stuff, just like for the technical people, we understand the concept of technical debt, where you sort of rush through things and you come back and clean it all up later. With platforms like this, I think we need to keep in mind things like I call it configuration debt, just making sure that you're keeping across some of the compromises you make to get speed to market. Make sure you're coming back and cleaning up and maybe refactoring your content hierarchy or your content taxonomy to make sure that it's always being optimized and maintained and understood. You only need a few people. If you're in a small team, like most of the retail clients we deal with, they've got very, very lean teams running really hard. They're thoroughbreds, these people. But there's turnover and people change. And if things aren't well documented and things aren't set up properly, it's very easy to come back and to walk in and see a bit of a mess inside your CMS or your email marketing platform or your customer service platform. It doesn't matter which one it is. So I think making sure you come back.
We've had a couple of calls with people that were just joining a team. They're like, I don't know how to do this. Like, how am I supposed to create content? And for sure, like the fact that you guys are documenting this and making it as easy as possible, definitely like in the future, as you said, like a new person comes in, just makes it so much easier for them to just become fully independent in creating content.
Yeah, and it's just treating it like a true discipline, right? Just like developers have spent the last decades getting their craft up to speed with with repos and all these sort of concepts and version control and everything else. I think it's great that people that are in charge of content can really use some grown-up tools and do some really solid stuff that Prismic allows you to do. So I think it's a really good opportunity for people working in content development and in brand marketing to really do some serious high value work that can bring some real opportunities to the brands. So I guess that sort of makes that point about sort of loading content and iterating, to making sure that as you load content and realize that there's a gap there's a certain type of content you can't produce, deal with that, work around it for today, but then make sure you've got a process for iterating on your content types and your development to accommodate them. The last point about separating campaigns from capability is, yes, you can change it. Yes, we can update it, but not for today's campaign that goes live tomorrow. Work within the constraints today and then make sure you update it so we have less constraints in future. And that you'll never get to the end. It's never finished. It's always an evolving process. So I think it's just making sure that people don't get frustrated by those limitations, that they just have a process to deal with them. And that really takes a lot of the heat out of what it means to be someone trying to trade the business today and put something out there really quickly. If you work within what you've got to work with, you'll be able to do that super, super fast. But if you keep pushing back and going, well, tomorrow's campaign needs to be fundamentally different than anything we've ever done before, so we need to also do the content capabilities. It can be done. I mean, it's not that hard. Once you get into the rhythm, it isn't really that hard to change it. But it's just about, I guess, being professional and disciplined here, just like all other parts of the business have to be.
Also, it changes the whole thinking about the investment in the content types. If you take the view that what you're building is just for today's campaign, then you're never going to be able to invest enough to really create a sophisticated solution. That's why that longevity is required.
Yeah, and I think there's something about campaign work and content marketing and brand marketing where I find that there are very, very obvious patterns when you look at the EDMs that are being sent or the home pages or landing pages that are being produced. There's some really obvious patterns, but I see designers fire up, Photoshop or Sketch and, start with a white page and start again every time. And it can't be efficient. Yet maybe they don't realize they're following a pattern. That's only in hindsight that you see it. But I think the idea of abstracting the structure of the stories we tell and working out what that looks like in reality. And even though you think you've done 365 different pieces of content this year, you've only really done 4. What's inside those grey blocks, what words you type and where you position these things might be different. But, a fashion story is a fashion story. A homeware story is a homeware story. And it always has these 5 elements mixed and matched different ways. And taking the time to see the forest from the trees sometimes, I think is just something that it's just not common in that discipline, I think. I think sometimes too, because the idea of templates can come across as being formulaic. And if it's formulaic, make, then it's unoriginal and then it'll look boring. But I think it actually frees you up to focus on what's inside those grey boxes, what words you do choose to craft and write, because that's what's going to make people excited when they look at these sorts of stories. And
to be fair, like I've seen a fair number of Prismic projects, and it's just like a blog, for instance, or something, and they have like maybe 4 slices within there, and that's pretty much it. And like the project's not going to evolve, but you can tell whenever you talk to those people, those content editors, like a year from the start, they're kind of bored with it. They're like, oh, I want more. Like I want to add that. And like whenever you kind of show them the slices and like you actually can create these, you can tell like, you know, there's like a little sparkle in their eyes. Like they get all excited. Like, oh my gosh, I can like add all these things. And it's true. And that's, you know, again, the core thought process of slices is making those blocks just like you can move them around. So at least you have that freedom. It's not just like your static template, the exact same like title, image, writer, and text block and images, and that's it. Like that was really like we were supposed to like free these people from that.
No, it should be liberating, not restrictive. But I can see how people see it that way when they're first sort of crossing this threshold into traditional CMS work and campaign work into structured content. But you know, the payoff is huge once you get it right. So I think that's for that slide. And the last thing, that's what we're doing now, and then where we're headed next with all of this. Is, if you can go to the next slide there, Adrian.
I know there's a little bit of a delay.
It's a bit of lag, yeah, cool. I mean, localization using locales. I mean, I think the locales feature within Prismic is very, very powerful, and you can use it in lots of interesting ways. It's not just about literal country locales, even though that's the quite obvious way to use it.
Well, yeah, there are custom locales. Sorry. No, go ahead, go for it.
Yeah, I mean, even the way that you can just fork certain pages or blocks of content for just if those certain bits need to be. So an Australia, New Zealand site, for example, is 95% consistent, but there's just a few parts, a few sections that need to be slightly adjusted. So I think, it's a really powerful way to give you that flexibility without necessarily needing to replicate the whole thing in separate repos.
But if you do want to like have it like completely different, sure, you can copy and paste. The one I see the most, especially for e-commerce, are like terms and services, and that like really changes it from country to another. And so you still have the same core document. You're just copying it over and like customizing it, localizing it for that. And I was just going to talk about, you also have more custom power in the sense that you can actually create your locales. So I see this a lot for people that want to create like English speaking EMEA, for instance, in that region, or APAC, and they want to like handle content specific for all that region, or that becomes like maybe like the default language. So imagine like you haven't localized content in this particular country, you can default back to that region. So there's a lot of things you can do with that locales. And actually, that's one of the new features we're announcing right now. It's still in beta right now, but we are granting basically granular locales roles, in the sense that you can have people be a writer in that language, be a publisher in this language, and all that, so that you have more fine control over that. So this is more in the sense of like, maybe not in the lean example we were talking about, where it's like small editorial teams that manage basically all the content for all the countries. But once you start expanding and maybe like adding one person for that locale, giving them control there, and kind of like going progressively.
Yeah, it's fantastic. Yeah, so letting that sort of local team take the core brand message and just twist it and spin it into the local representation to make it that little bit of effort of truly localizing content can make a huge difference. I think people that are selling into second and third and onwards countries, unless they really have boots on the ground, they really can come across as not really relevant to the local markets, and local markets can smell it a mile away. So just putting that little bit of extra effort in. But if you don't want those local editors to have carte blanche access to everything else, then I think that's a really powerful feature that's coming down the line. So I think that'll be used really well. We've got a couple of examples where we've got a client using it using tags. So we're just using the basic tag functionality. We've called them profile tags, but it's just a simple convention of tags where like male, female, top tier, bottom tier, gold, silver, just all these sorts of things that either show or hide this content if the person who's looking at the feed of content is or isn't male or female, or is or isn't a gold customer, or is or isn't something else. So a really simple application to deal with personalized content. Looking at sort of building in more integration field sources. So products from Shopify makes a lot of sense, but being able to integrate to other services and platforms, often our work is about building up CX ecosystems. So there are a lot of very smart systems that have very, very interesting bits of content that's available to someone, and making sure that we can pass that through in very simple ways is hugely important to us to speed up that content production capability for the brands.
That's great, Dan. You're taking the words right out of my mouth there. Actually, for the using the integration fields for the tags, that's what we're thinking right now. More and more people, just like allowing them to pick whatever persona, I guess, you want to have for this content, or even on the slice level. So for sure, that's like something we're expanding on.
Yeah, no, I think it's one of those things where as you sort of peel back each layer of the onion, you sort of realize there's more and more that you can do. But you've got to, I think that's the trap with all these sorts of things, and we see with a lot of platforms, is it's what we call the what can we have, what do you want death spiral of no progress. So I think as a brand, the job is to really, really articulate what you want, because the platform can do it. But if you just ask what the platform can do, it can do almost anything. And not just Prismic platform, but whether it's a headless architecture or anything else. So I think I see a lot of brands asking what can it do, and in the hope that a strategy might manifest on their side. Whereas I think as a brand, you must come to the table with what you want to do. What are the experiences that you want your customers to have? And then how is this tool going to solve for that? You can't just keep asking, what can it do? It's nice to know, but don't build a strategy based on that. The last little point I'll make here before we throw to questions, I guess, is that this idea that personalization and building lots of different content for different types of customers, I think everyone talks about this. But I see a lot of it, the wheels fall off it when people try to actually achieve it seriously, because it takes scale to do that. If you thought it was hard putting content together for a brand generally, now try do it for different genders. Now try do it for 4 different tiers or classes of customer. Now try do it for different locales. Every time you do that, it's not a plus, it's a multiply. So I think people run to platforms with the promise of personalization, but you need to feed that. Unless you're doing literally content being generated by machine, then, and we've all seen what they look like. You only have to look at a travel brand's content to see what content by machine looks like. It's pretty uninspiring. But this is not what this is about. I think this is about making sure that the brands are telling its stories. So I think just be careful of the personalization promise. I think it's really important to think it through carefully, but it's a big mouth to feed, and you need to tread into it very carefully to make sure that you can scale up to that content promise. There's no point building huge personalization capability if you can't feed that machine with new and interesting stories. Because if it's just all machine generated, we're sort of back to where we started.
It's always on the wish list of the marketing teams we talk to. It's like, oh, we don't want personalized content. We're like, really? Okay, so what do you want to do? Because then, as you said, like the multiplier, it just becomes like this exponentially harder to manage content strategy. And so they want it, but then when they start realizing, well, actually, you need to like duplicate this content and really localize it every time, they're just like, okay, this is actually a bit more of a headache than we first expected.
Yeah, careful what you wish for. But if you do it smart, and if you do it, if you're making sure that your highest value customers and your highest value experiences are where you focus your efforts, then the payoff can be big. But just don't try to make it personalized for everyone, because there's a real law of diminishing returns as you start moving towards most customers. Most customers aren't that valuable. Some customers are very, very valuable. So focus your efforts on making sure they're getting what they need from your brand's content, on your experiences that you put out there for them.
And especially the way you guys did is great. It's what we recommend, not doing it from the get-go, like first installing that first like brick basically, and then starting to iterate, adding personas gradually versus just like big bang and personalize everything.
Yeah, and then not using it. Yeah, for sure.
Exactly. All right, great. Well, thanks, guys. So we're going to head over to questions now. I've already got a couple questions ready. So the first one is from Tim. What's the handover process look like? Do your clients take over everything once the website is live? And how do you teach them to use Prismic?
Good question. The handover process. Look, typically, we're very big on clients being able to take over the management of what we've built for them internally. And more, we're seeing that on the client side, they're building out their internal tech teams as well. So no longer are they just taking over how to use Prismic, they're taking over how to work with this headless front end, if it is a headless front end. And then I think a relevant point on that topic is really another benefit of taking the headless approach, which is that it's something that good developers want to work with modern technology, and they don't want to be stuck working on a platform. Just a sideline point there. In terms of the handover and the training of the Prismic components, so as we mentioned before, it's just getting the right level of documentation for the client and the right level of handholding. We're always available to support clients if they've got questions or they want to make some optimization changes. And again, they often do that internally as well. But really it comes down to some fairly rudimentary documentation. It's very valuable documentation, but it's not over the top. And normally that documentation is produced as part of the design of the content blocks. It's not like you turn up at the end of the project and have to document everything that you did. It was the plan. Yeah, so I hope that answers the question.
We've got some workshops where you run through this stuff together and turn up with next week's content ready to go. And rather than doing it in an abstract way, let's get the first, the go live content loaded in together. We won't do it for you. We'll do it with you. So I think just hands on the ground, just getting it in there and getting it done is often the quickest way. And it seems to stick. I think a lot of people in fast moving retail, especially, don't have time to learn things conceptually. They want to learn things actually while they're doing it. So I think just being there for that first run of content and the first few weeks of getting stuff over, just a few short half-hour workshops is usually more than enough.
Yeah. And that's usually why we do emphasize on the ability to have drafts inside of Prismic and have previews, so you can actually start typing in some content and actually seeing what this is going to look like and having that process of back and forth, so at least they know that they're actually creating something versus just publishing and hopefully it looks good.
Yeah, for sure.
All right, so the next question from Joe: what's the biggest impact of good content for an e-commerce website? Is it directly in sales, bounce rate, or more for brand identity?
Look, I think some of these metrics are I find them sort of hard to understand sometimes. I think bounce rate is really, where are they landing on and what job were they trying to do in the first place? If they're trying to get, if they're trying to find their local store and they land on the store finder page and they find that answer on one page, that's classed as a bounce, but I'd class that as a success. So I think you got to be careful looking at some of these metrics sometimes. When it comes to if you're only measuring e-commerce or the website success based on the number of e-commerce sales that it does, I think that can sometimes be misleading too. If you've got especially if you're a multi-channel retailer, if you're a pure play retailer, then yes, you need to conversion rates and those sorts of things are hugely important to look at. But we see for our multi-channel brands, quite small conversion rates because the customers are using the website to inform a future in-store purchase. They're not buying online today or ever, maybe, with this brand. I mean, that's changing now, but I think we need to be careful not to class that sort of 95% of visits as a failed visit if a customer's decided to spend some time looking at content. If they're inspired, if they like what they see, and you can track that they've purchased, and that's where that whole customer part comes in. If you know which customers are visiting your site and what they're looking at, and then what that leads to within the next few days, then that's the sort of attributes you need to be focusing on. I think also too, the freshness of the site. I think if the process of publishing content is very, very easy and quick, then making sure the site is fresh, especially in sort of fast fashion retail, the ability to turn that content over quickly is hugely important. So that just helps even just with general SEO, the fact that customers are coming back more often, they're seeing different words, it's being indexed more often, there's freshness on the site. So I think there's a lot of different attributes that you can see. You can directly attribute to the choice of a fast content management platform like this.
All right. I've got one last question here from Ben, but this may be a little bit too technical, maybe too long. We've only got 0 minutes left at this point. Do you guys want to try and go for it, or?
Yeah, we got quick.
I love the challenge.
All right. I wonder, how was your experience as developers implementing this type of website, including the creation of your React components, matching them with slices, maintaining them, involving them over time? Did you find a need for a tool like Storybook to share with the rest of the team?
It's 6 o'clock.
I can't answer the Storybook bit, but the team love it. I mean, compared to other CMS platforms or working inside themes on top of e-commerce platforms, it's night and day. So their experience was they loved it, and they've wondered why it took us so long to find something like this.
So Ben, if you want more detail on that, feel free to reach out to us and we'll happily put you in touch with some of our lead devs and they can give you all that sort of detail that you're looking for.
For sure.
We'll be sharing, obviously, your contact information of Danny and John after the webinar. We'll be sharing the video of everyone who attended or everyone who signed up. I guess, Danny, John, again, thank you so much for your time. This was great. Thanks for talking about this. Great use case. And, I guess hopefully we'll talk soon about some more topics like this.
No worries.
Excellent. Thanks for having us.